Hey everyone, and welcome back to World History. Today we're going to talk about our last early group of civilization. Specifically, we're going to talk about a lot of them because we're going to go over the early empires. So this is going to be a lot in this video, so just take a deep breath, get ready to write. I know that we're going to go over quite a lot of different civilizations. I'm going to briefly talk about each one. Most of them are not something you seriously have to remember everything about. It is these early civilizations and these early empires are important, but they aren't all encompassing. So just keep that in mind. 2, anything really important we will also discuss in class. So just keep that in mind and be ready to go and do your very best. So like I said, we're going to talk about some early civilizations. So we're going to talk about Mesopotamia and the early empires of Mesopotamia, Egypt, as well as what is considered Asia Minor through Assyria and Persia. As we go through, remember to write down any important vocabulary as well as any questions you have and important information. Think about our essential question for this week, which is what are the factors that turn a civilization into an empire? So think about that question as we go through. As we go through, if you see the star, that means this is standards that that are important and need to remember. If you see the brain, that means this is prior knowledge. And if you see the bell, that means this is testable material. So let's jump right in. So Mesopotamia, we have talked about Mesopotamia so much. And it's a lot of this because that Fertile Crescent allowed for so many civilizations to rise and fall, as well as empires. So if you remember Samar, which was one of the first civilizations of early Mesopotamia, well, they had some neighbors. They were called Akkad. The Akkad saw Samar and kind of its civilization and its flourishing, and he was like, you know what? We like that. I'm going to take it. So this Akkad actually went over to Samar, so you see Akkad's right here and Samar is down here. So Akkad will actually go over to Samar and begin mixing cultures and value. They'll have a lot of trade, which result in this. And in 2300 BCE, Sargon, who was the leader of Samar, actually became the leader of both Samar. The leader of Akkad became both the leader of Akkad and Samar. So he conquered Samar, and this became the first empire that we know today. So the Akkad is the first one to kind of be like, you know what? I want what they have over there, so I'm going to go and I'm going to take it, and then I'm going to smush our countries together, and that's how we found our first empire. So like I said, we have the Akkad or Akkadians. The Akkad were a group of people who developed in the Fertile Crescent. Sargon was this divine ruler, like many others. He was a baby found floating on a basket of reeds, and he rose basically from a commoner all the way up to the rank of king through a lot of knowledge and time, and became the king of Akkad. He would see the chance to raise an army and conquer all of the Fertile Crescent. His big thing was blending culture and values. So this early empire was all about blending culture and values, and we'll talk more about how blending culture and values kind of is one of those stepping stones that make us turn a civilization into an empire. But so he blended a lot of things, and he adopted cuneiform as a written language and mixed the gods of Samar and Akkad. He also developed trade routes along the two nations, allowing for ease of trade. However, in 2190 BCE, the Sumerian people actually revolt, resulting in the fall of the Akkadian Empire. One of the key things I want you to pay attention to is this area called Anatolia, also known as Asia Minor. We'll talk a lot about Asia Minor, which is in like modern day Turkey, and it was a key connecting point between kind of Asia and the Middle East and Europe. So it's right in between. And so one of the biggest reasons Sargon conquered this area and was considered the first empire is because he took that area, which is Asia Minor today. After the Akkadian Empire with the Babylonians, when the Sargonians fell, when Sargon fell, this really became the rise of nomadic tribes. So even though Samar kind of was the one to revolt, it didn't take over, it didn't develop its own nation. So instead you have all of these city-states that are forming, and one of those city-states were the city-state of the Amorites. And the Amorites developed one of the largest city-states called Babylon, which is you hear about it everywhere. You hear about it in the Bible, you hear about it in culture and history. The Babylon and what it presents is going to last a really long time. We'll talk about it often. So it's one of these early city-states and one of the largest ones to develop. And in 1790 BCE, the Amorite king of Babylon was named Hammurabi. Hammurabi would be like, you know what? I want more land. I want more people. So he's going to rush and conquer most of the Fertile Crescent and develop in government and law along the way. So he developed officials, taxation, religious temples, irrigation systems, trade, all of which would allow for it to be a very prosperous nation at the time. However, a few short later in 1595 BCE, with the death of Hammurabi, the city-states kind of crumbled. And there was rising powers coming down from the north, called the Hittites, which would take over and kind of begin ruling instead of Babylon. Before we get into the Hittites, I want to talk a little bit about Hammurabi's code, though. Hammurabi's code was this huge stone pillar that you see on here that was created by Hammurabi and had over 282 written laws. And he carved 282 laws into the stone. So a 7 feet tall stone pillar, and it was the first time we ever see a written record of laws like this. There were actually copies made on clay tablets that could be distributed, but this big pillar was actually posted in the middle of Babylon. And the laws covered a variety of things, from social and public laws, like who can get divorced, lawsuits, civil issues, as well as criminal punishments like killing, stealing, and self-defense. The biggest thing to remember about Hammurabi's code is this concept of an eye for an eye. You do someone wrong, they can do something wrong back to you. For example, if you steal something, you'll lose your hand, or if you lie, you can lose your tongue. So the idea was that if you did something bad, prepared for something bad to happen to you, which would be kind of the basis of society at this time for many years to come. In addition, we have this concept of migration that I wanted to talk about before we get into the Hittites. So where did the Hittites actually come from? So first off, we have the Indo-Europeans. This was people that lived in the grasslands of what is modern day Russia. And around 3000 BCE, they began to kind of spread out. The grasslands were not doing them really good. There was a lot of issues. It wasn't very fertile. So like, we need to find better land. So for about 2,000 years, from about 3000 BCE to about 1000 BCE, you see this migration of these Indo-Europeans. So we have a group called the Aryans who would go south into India, and we'll talk about that when we talk about classic India. We have the Hittites, which we just talked about, which will go into southwest and to the Middle Eastern, Asia Minor area. And then we have the Celts, who would go west into Europe, into what is modern day Ireland. And so why did they move? Well, this is this concept called push and pull factor. So when we talk about migration, a lot of it is this push factor. Something is happening in the area that is forcing people to leave, whether it's bad harvest, famine, or conquerors. Either way, people are fleeing for their lives. They need to leave, and so they leave, as well as pull factors, things that are leading people toward something. So one of the biggest things that will lead people towards something is stable rule, fertile land, no people being there, so that if they have empty land, they're going to go to some place where there's no one so that they can develop. And all of these are going to be important concepts of migrations. And like I stated, one of the biggest migrants that we have are the Hittites. They're going to migrate from Indo-Europe and settle in the highlands of what is Asia Minor or Turkey. They developed iron tools and weapons, which is really important because remember, we're still in the Bronze Age. Bronze is very fragile. It chips really easy. It bends really easy. Remember, it's a mixing of two different metals, copper and iron. And so it was really flexible, but pure iron was much more inflexible and was very sturdy. And so these iron tools would be used, and they would keep it a secret for a really long time. So they wouldn't tell anyone how to make these in order to kind of have a tactical advantage. They also had chariot warfare, which was a new concept at this time. So what would happen is you would have kind of an animal, using either a horse or, like in this case, based on a picture, we have this ox, which would pull this huge chariot or wagon with wheels. And you would have 3 men. So you have one person holding the reins, kind of guiding, and then you would have one guy who has a spear, and he would like stab, and then you have another guy who has like a net, or sometimes would just be like kind of a scout to kind of like direct where you're supposed to be going. And so you had this 3-man team who kind of protected the main guy in the middle who was driving, as well as 2 guys who were attacking and kind of directing. In the 16th century, they would actually march on Babylon and take over it and form a new empire that would stretch all the way to the Black Sea. So this is a huge encompassing empire. And much like the Babylonians, they were cultural borrowers. They like to steal culture from everybody else. So they took off lots of different pottery from what is Asia. They took cuneiform from the Sumerians. They made laws like Hammurabi. They developed agriculture like the Mesopotamians, and they had many mixing of gods from all of these different cultures. So very much about borrowing other cultures and kind of mixing culture together to form something new. At the same time, we have the development of Egypt. We talked about Egypt in our last video. However, we're going to talk a little bit more about modern Egypt. So while Mesopotamia was kind of figuring itself out, developing these early empires, Egypt was thriving. It had the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom. However, in about 1630, we see the invasion of the Hyksos invaders. The Hyksos literally means rulers of foreign land. And they basically were Western nomads, much like the Hittites. They had advanced technology in iron, and they were going against weak pharaohs. So towards the end of the Middle Age, we have very weak pharaohs who have kind of like no control over what's going on, and they basically take it over. The Hyksos take over. They destroy everything and kind of gain control of the northern part of the Nile. So that's the southern part. Towards the top of the delta, the southern Thebes, who survived and kind of lived there, but they had to pay tribute to the Hyksos, which was a form of payment when made to show like a direct a gesture of submission or surrender, basically saying, y'all win, we lost, sorry about that. But they did that for many years. However, in about 1500 BCE, the Thebes rebelled. So Thutmose the first of Thebes was the king of that area, and he actually conquered the southern part of Egypt and declared himself king. And he actually he spread out the Egyptian empire. So before, Egypt was kind of just mostly this land, but now he's conquered like all of Canaan, all of Kush, as well as Put. So they kind of took over a wide part of land. So this new kingdom was, most of the people in this kingdom were aggressive conquerors. They're going to spread far and wide, kind of gain land, slaves, people, resources, anything they can. And they're going to expand Egypt as well as gain a massive wealth. So for some of our early pharaohs of the New Kingdom was Hatshepsut and Thutmose. I'm saying those wrong 100%, but I do my best. Just read through it. So Hatshepsut was a famous female pharaoh. So she started actually as a regent, or somebody who rules in place of a monarch who's either absent, disabled, or too young. In this case, she ruled for her son, who was Thutmose III, who was much too young to be a ruler, so she kind of ruled instead. However, after a while, she was like, you know what? I'm gonna be pharaoh. So she became pharaoh, and she was actually known for wearing a false beard, which is this little piece that was on her chin, to kind of be like, I'm a man, I'm strong, I'm in charge. And one of the biggest things is she developed trade with Put, which was an African kingdom at this time, and they traded things like incense, myrrh, as well as exotic animal furs. When Thutmose came of age, he actually took over, became one of the most aggressive rulers at the time, spreading out and conquering for many years. He actually went through 20 full years of warring. Every year he would declare war on somebody else and kind of ruled very much with this idea of like conquer and take over and control. After them, we have Akhenaten, who developed a new religion at this time. So in 1300 BCE, Pharaoh Amenhotep IV actually outlawed polytheism, which was again the worship of many gods, and developed a new religion based on a powerful sun god called Aten. And so this was one of our first instances we have of a monotheistic religion, so the belief in one god or deity. And then he changed his name from Amenhotep the fourth to Pharaoh Akhenaten, which means spirit of Atan. He actually developed a new capital based in Atan. However, while he did all those things, he failed to convert the people. While he was like, I'm all for Atan, everyone else was like, no, we don't like this. And so basically after he died, it fell through. A new pharaoh, Tutankhamun, which you probably know as the boy pharaoh. He was 10 years old. Most likely he was a puppet pharaoh. He actually wasn't ruling. Most likely the priests and government officials ruled in his stead, and they destroyed Akhenaten's laws and rules, destroying Atan's palaces and temples, and kind of erased a big portion of this history. We did not know any of this until 1922, when the tomb of Tutankhamun was found, and all of this stuff like came to light. Before that, this had been completely erased from Egyptian history. After we have Ramses the Great, and this is probably one of the most famous pharaohs of ancient Egypt. So he was the longest ruling pharaoh. He ruled for over 60 years, which is longer than any other pharaoh of the time. He fended off revolt as well as invaders and other people trying to take over the land. And specifically, he fended off the Hittites. So the Hittites, at this time, really wanted to expand outwards. So they were expanding down while Egypt was trying to expand up, and kind of they clashed and had a lot of fighting. It's really interesting, the records of what happened between these two groups, because basically all the Hittite records said that Ramses was often defeated and he could never win and he was never any good, while all of Ramesses' records say that he was the best, that he always won, the Hittites always lost. So we don't really know who was right. However, at some point they wrote up a peace treaty, which is a contract formed between two groups to resolve tension or conflicts. And it had conditions. So they'd had a part of this treaty was like culture exchange. So they had to trade culture and values, trade deals, as well as marriage. So a couple of the Hittite princesses married into Ramesses' family. He was also known for building projects, much like other great pharaohs. He built temples, monuments, and tombs. Ones that those big ones with the giant pillars that we all are known, that we see and know for. He built those, as well as he had slave labor. So before this, most of the labor is done by Egyptians. So most of the labor is done by peasant Egyptians. However, during Ramses, there's very likely that when he conquered people, he would take them as slaves. And so one of the biggest ones that there's some speculation that in the Bible, when it talks about the Hebrew people being taken as slaves, it's during Ramses the Great's time, but we don't know for sure because there isn't any written records in Egypt about it, even if we have the context in the Bible. So that's most likely where it would have fit in history, but we're unsure of exactly what it would have looked like and whether or not Egypt has any records of it. So decline. So, like any great nation, it eventually comes to an end. After Ramses, there wasn't a lot of really good, strong pharaohs. Most of them were fairly weak. And this actually caused a lot of issues with the government officials. So the governors of these different nations who were under the pharaoh were like, oh, these people aren't doing well. So they revolted, and as well as the people rebelled, specifically those who were enslaved. So the Libyans actually marched down and attacked, as well as the Kush came up and attacked from the south. And in 1750 BCE, Egypt had officially fallen. This is the end of our Egyptian kingdoms and kind of the last remnants we have of what's ancient Egypt. After this, we have the development of multiple tribal rules that would kind of take over, and then they would rule for a very long time until the Kush was like, we want to take over. So some backstory about the Kush. The Kush were a group of African people kind of to the south of Egypt, and when Egypt was expanding, they took control. So the Kush were kind of under Egypt for many, many, many generations. And kind of what happened is they fell in love with it. They fell in love with the culture and the beauty of Egypt. And so when Egypt began to fall, the Kush were like, we're taking over, we're going north. They marched north, but not really to take over the land, though they did do that, but protect Egyptian art and culture. They didn't want the Libyans and the Assyrians, the Hittites to destroy the art and culture that was Egypt. So they marched north in order to take over and protect this culture. In 1750 BCE, Pi, who was the Kush king, he would go north and conquer Egypt and become the first Kush and Egyptian pharaoh. And then basically from then on, we still have some pharaohs in Egypt after this, but most of them were proxies or not, they weren't Egyptian pharaohs. They were pharaohs from different cultures, most of them Kush, but also we'll get into Greece later on. We'll talk about Cleopatra. But the biggest thing that Kush did is they revived the old kingdom of Egypt's culture and values. So they wanted to bring back those huge monuments and those pyramids. And so some of the smaller pyramids you see that are a little bit different in structure, that kind of have that brought up, that was from the Kush Empire, kind of trying to recreate what happened during the old Egyptian period. So at the same time that Egypt is kind of coming to a close, we have the development of Assyria. Assyria was one of the biggest empires of the age. So while Egypt was coming to a close, Babylon was being taken over by the Hittites. But then after that, we have the conquer of Babylon to Persia Gulf by the Assyrians. The Assyrians kind of take over and take over Babylon, the Persian Gulf, kind of all of what is the Fertile Crescent. And the biggest thing is they learned how to make iron weapons from the Hittites. This is really where you get to see that major switch from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. While it isn't perfect, we have some overlap, and especially like Egypt is still going to be using bronze for a couple more generations. This is one of the big changes that we have into moving the new age of iron. One of the big things they had was art and learning. They were all about beauty and art, and they developed the city of Nineveh. Nineveh was the capital of Assyria, and it was considered the most beautiful city in the world. It had these beautiful statues and monuments and writings that kind of were spread out everywhere. They also had what's called proxy rulers or governors, and these are people who ruled over like a piece or a portion of land instead of the actual ruler or king. And so at this time, instead of having kind of one person over the whole land, it was so big that they would have like lords or governors over different individual parts of the land. And we'll start seeing that more and more kind of from here on as we go into the other empires. However, these proxy rulers and the king grew arrogant in their abilities and laxed. And the people that were kind of being oppressed by Assyria began to rebel and revolt. And in 612 BCE, we have the Chaldeans kind of rose up and rebelled, as well as some other countries at the same time. So the Chaldeans took over Assyria with the Medes, and they kind of split the land. They destroyed Nineveh and rebuilt Babylon as the new capital. One of the most famous was Nebuchadnezzar II. Nebuchadnezzar II conquered modern-day Israel and Jerusalem, destroying the first temple, and then took all of the Hebrew people, the Israelites, as slaves and took them back to Babylon to work as slaves. He, however, did a lot for technology and culture. He loved beauty, so he built all of these beautiful, amazing things, as well as had the development of herbalism and stargazing, which result in a lot of modern day medicines, as well as astrology, which is the practice of consulting the stars for religious or spiritual beliefs, typically done to tell the future. And this would be important concepts that would develop in this area, which would lead to astronomy, which was the study of the stars. After Assyria, we have the Persians. So going back to the Indo-European migration, you have the Persians who kind of come down to what is modern-day Persia Gulf, kind of settle there. They were taken over by the Assyrians, but then the Chaldeans, and then when the Assyrians kind of took over, they kind of fell back. But the land there is not very farmable. So they lived in the Persian Gulf, but it was not very farmable. Instead, they had a lot of minerals like iron, salt, and other goods, and these resources were really plentiful, and so they used those in trade, and they kind of just lived under the Medes rule in that area for many years. They kind of just like, we're fine with this, we don't really need to be in charge. But in 5050 BCE, we have Cyrus the Great. He was a son of a lesser king of early Persia, and he basically was like, I don't want to live like this. So what he did is he conquered all of the Medes, as well as going north and conquering Assyria, creating the Persian Empire. And in 5039 BCE, he was like, I want more land. So he marched north toward Babylon. And the big thing about him is he was mostly conquered people peacefully. So at the time, a lot of people were tired of the Chaldeans' rule. They were very strict and kind of oppressive. And so Cyrus the Great kind of came and was like, I'll let you do whatever you want. And they were like, cool, come on in. And they basically opened their towns for him in a lot of cases. So the culture and society of early Persia, like I said, it was all about tolerance over terror. So instead of trying to force a culture on people, what he did was kind of like say, you can keep your culture, customs, and values. I don't really care. He made a rule with his soldiers that they couldn't loot or burn anything, which was really important because it made people like him. Like, hey, our stuff's not going to be destroyed if he comes into our city. He returned people back to their homeland. So when the Israelites were forced to go to Babylon, it was like, go home, go back to Israel and build a new temple, as well as some of the other people that were enslaved like that, as well as restored temples and beliefs. So a lot of gods that had been and religions that were forced to kind of not be practiced, he was like, y'all can practice them, I don't care. He also had elite warriors, and he was one as well. So he developed these elite warriors that helped him kind of conquer everything. And he did that by training from a young age. Another big thing is for many years, much like the hieroglyphs, cuneiform was lost to the ages. We didn't know it. We didn't know what it was. But during Cyrus the Great, he developed this tablet that, much like Rosetta Stone, had the same messages written in 3 different languages. And it was actually how we eventually deciphered cuneiform and kind of could understand it today. The last thing a part of the Persian Empire was its government. So Cyrus the Great kind of ruled basically the same as every other empire at that time. However, with Darius the Great, which was his successor, was a little different. So most likely Darius was not a direct relative of Cyrus the Great, and therefore should not have become king. However, there was a lot of confusion over who should take over after Cyrus died, and so he kind of was like, I had a vision that I should be king, and so he became the ruler. He basically stole the throne. But he was a great ruler regardless of how he became king. One of the big things he did was build an army, and a part of this army was his 10,000 elite bodyguards called the Immortals. And they were called that because whenever one died, another one would immediately come to replace it. So it was always 10,000 elite soldiers. And so it looked like they never died. They were just this ultimate elite bodyguard force that was like unkillable. It was terrifying and allowed for him to kind of spread out and can begin to conquer even further north. Much like the Assyrians and the Chaldeans, they developed provinces which were ruled by these people called satraps, which were a Persian noble group who governed various provinces in the Persian Empire instead of the king. He also developed infrastructure such as royal roads and highways, which these were roads, bridges, and places to stay for travel and communication, which helped ease trade, allowed for military control because the military could mobilize very quickly and go along its roads, as well as created one of the first ever postal systems, which would really be important to communication as Darius began to go north and conquer. However, much like many kingdoms, Persia did begin to decline. Persia, took too much on his plate, and he went too far north and was beaten back by the Greeks, specifically Athens and Sparta, which we'll talk about when we talk about Greece. His son Xerxes vowed revenge against the Greeks. However, much like Darius, he was defeated. After his defeat, there was a long decline. After Xerxes, there wasn't really any great, powerful kings. They were fairly weak. There was royal infighting. The satraps lost trust in the rulers. The infrastructure began to break down, which resulted in trade decrease and resulted in poverty. And so the kingdom, for many years, began to just spiral out of control and die out, which would eventually lead to 334 BCE with the conquering of Persia by Alexander the Great, which we'll talk about when we talk about the Chaldeans and Greece. However, even though Persia kind of fell, it did have a great legacy. It was one of the longest running kingdoms with over 2,000 years of peaceful rule, so not a lot of fighting. There's very peaceful rule with a vast amount of territory and people. It developed a loyalty with people in a brand new way. And most times, people were conquered and suppressed. They were forced to follow the rules and the values of the conquerors. Instead, Persia accepted and had peace with the people. It was very tolerant to all different views and beliefs. They adopted a variety of cultures like Lydian coinage, Greek, Sumerian, and Egyptian art, Assyrian and Egyptian architecture, as well as people and material from all over the world. One of the lasting Persian legacies was actually the Persian religion. So it was the religion of the Persian king. Not a lot of people practice it, but the Persian royalty did. It was developed by an ancient sage called Zoroaster, and the religion was called Zoroastrianism, and it was the belief that the world was divided between forces of good and evil, and that was gods over each, and that all people could pick one of these sides in their life, and that at death would face punishment or judgment upon death for these sides. And so this religion is actually still alive today, especially in modern India, and that was one of the lasting legacies of the Persian Empire. So here's a timeline. It is very crazy. A lot of things happened in this short period of time between 2500 BCE to about 500 BCE, 2,000 years. Most of it was the Bronze Age with the Indo-European migration. However, about a little after 1000 BCE, we have the development of the early Iron Age. We have the Old Kingdom and the New Kingdom of Egypt, and at the same time, Sargon established our first empire. And then we have in 1790 BCE, Babylon's rise and the development of the Hammurabi's Code. Egypt's New Kingdom came to flourish, and it flourished for over 500 years before falling. And we have Nebuchadnezzar, who rebuilt Babylon, as well as the arrival of our Persian Empire, which again would last for over 2,000 years. As we leave today, I want you to think about the following things. What exactly was the patterns do we see of these early empires? They all rose and fell. For 2,000 years of history, we see you see them rising and falling. We see them kind of saying, you know what, we want this trade route or resources or land, so they go and take over. They develop wealth, power, and armies only for weak kings and kind of unstable rules to result in the fall. Each ruler kind of tried different tactics of rule. No one was quite the same. We have everything from full suppression to full tolerance and everything in between. However, one thing that was kind of united along all avenues was they unable to remain united for long. So for our question today, look at the word empire, which it comes from the Latin word imperium, to command. What are the factors that turn a civilization into an empire? There is a difference. Think about what it is. Okay, as you head out, remember to do your post-lecture assessment. I will see you all in class. If you have any questions, feel free to email me, call me, text me, or come to office hours on Thursday. Have a great day, and I will see you all in class.